get on Facebook.
It says it's live on Facebook.
It's preparing.
Okay. Well,
All right, I think we're there, so go on.
Okay, so welcome everyone. We have about 34, 33 participants so far, and it's growing. This is Science and Science Fiction with Dr. Fred Silva. We're very happy to have Fred participate in his pilot class this afternoon, and glad you were all able to join us. Gina and I, my name is Leah, Gina and I are going to be on the class to help monitor your questions and comments. I will be looking for your blue raised hands, and Gina will be looking for your chat written in questions in the chat box. But Fred has a lot to cover, so we're going to hold questions until the end of his time when he gives us the cue to start looking for your questions and comments, and we'll help sort of monitor that so we don't all speak over each other. As you're entering the classroom today, your microphones will be muted, and this is to eliminate any background distractions. But at the time that we give you the go-ahead, we'll let you unmute yourself to ask your questions. So we're glad you're here. Without taking up one more comment, keep your devices plugged in, because we have found that Zoom meetings take up a lot of battery, and we don't want you to have to run out of juice in the middle of a class. And these classes are all free and open to the public, so we're happy to have out-of-staters and non-LifeQuest members and family members participate with us today. So share this information. We're being recorded live on Facebook on the LifeQuest of Arkansas Facebook page, and then this whole meeting will be uploaded to the LifeQuest website after today's class. So you'll get to see it down the road. Okay, Fred, take it away. I will mute myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our starship, the USS LifeQuest, whose 40-minute mission is to take you where few have gone before. We will travel to stars and galaxies. So put on your seatbelts, bring your imagination and more. We'll go from real to real and back again. And on these trips, we will hopefully in the future find aliens, multiple verses, time travel, robots, artificial intelligence, deal with space and time, as well as ourselves. So let's get started. The first question is, why in the world, or out of this world, are we going to deal with science and science fiction? Well, the reasons are multiple. It's a way to present science in a relatively painless way. It will instill creativity and curiosity and imagination and awe. It actually is a mirror. It tells us about ourselves. It reflects on us as human beings and may ask questions that we might be hesitant to ask in any other way. It raises broad, important questions and asks, what are the consequences of what we and others do? The definition of science fiction varies, but here is one, a genre of speculative fiction that typically deals with imagination and futuristic concepts, a literature of ideas that explores the potential consequences of scientific, social, and technological innovations. Muted. I'm unmuted. Good. People have been trying to do that for a long time. I'm not going to go over all of the tens of thousands of science fiction authors and their works, but I will indicate that the PBS, in what was called the Great Read 2 years ago, had a movie and a book called the Book of Books, where they explored what they thought were the 100 best novels. And in the Great American Read, there were 14 genres, 13 of which, that's a high percentage, were considered science fiction. And here you see some of them ranging from Dune and Frankenstein to the presently popular Handmaid's Tale, Hitchhiker's Guide, and so on. And here is the rest of the 13. Now you'll see at the very bottom, there are some crossovers between horror and fantasy and adventure and a number of other genres that blend in with science fiction. So at least according to the PBS, science fiction is a great read. How do we get started? Well, getting started is always tough, and there's different ways that we could present science and science fiction. One is to go through the history and the evolution. One is to look at the different genres, as I had on the first slide. One is to give you specific examples of your favorite books or movies or TV or graphic novels we used to call comic books. One is to go through the real science that a lot of these authors in hard science utilize. And of course, there are other relationships in philosophy, religion, ethics, politics, environment, and so on. The history of science fiction, there's two schools of thought. One is it's been with us as long as humankind, and you see the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, as well as those works in India, Sanskrit, Hindu, Arabic, and even the Greeks. Others say, well, science fiction only became possible during the scientific revolution with major discoveries. The history of science fiction, as I see it, had its beginnings in ancient times when the line between myth and fact was blurred. Lucian, in the 2nd century, wrote a true story which dealt with travels to other worlds, extraterrestrials, interplanetary warfare, artificial life, and some people feel it was the first science fiction novel. It's always impossible to decide who is first in anything for reasons we can talk about later. As I said before, science fiction is a mirror that reflects back on us. It shows us our faults and about broader historical and cultural movements. When we look at science fiction and science, we have to ask ourselves, well, is the science they use true? Is it based on good science? That's called hard science fiction. Is it possible? We're not done yet, hopefully. And so maybe in the future, things are possible that are not possible now. We know there are certain things that are impossible, it seems at this time, such as something going through space as information faster than the speed of light. It's going to be hard to disprove Einstein. And prediction, as technology grows, movies and TVs, as we'll see, often incorporate what may be in the very near future, such as the movie Gattaca. It tells us about a number of other things. It talks about free will. It talks about exploration and teleportation, alien visitation, time travel, other universes, artificial intelligence, computer simulations of which we may be a part, if you believe in Matrix and want to take the red pill, and transhumanism, which is to make ourselves even better. One of the first works in science fiction was by the great astronomer Kepler. This was published in 1635. And what's interesting is, some of you know, Kepler studied with Tycho Brahe and incorporated him in his book as they were transported to another planet and observed the motion of other bodies in the solar system from another planet. So science fiction was around early on. The first science fiction movie was a short movie in 1902, and here you see It's a trip to the moon. And this Frenchman, began his career as a stage magician, but became a pioneer of motion picture special effects. He based it on elements from two science fiction novels by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who are obviously some of the fathers of science fiction. So one of the things that we will see during this trip is that people gave rise to ideas that were incorporated by subsequent authors. The first feature-length science fiction film was, as many of you know, Metropolis, and it dealt with the leader of an elite society that tried to respond to an eccentric scientist who wanted to disrupt a labor uprising by replacing the female uprising leader with the robot. And so this was one of the first visions of robots, although the name, as we'll see later, came from a Czech word. Well, here's Jules Verne, who wrote 54 novels, including some of the books that many of us grew up with. H.G. Wells, who was a polymath, who really dealt with all kinds of things and wrote a massive history of the world. And of course, his works are timeless, no pun intended there, with The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, Island of Dr. Moreau, and so on. Now, I have a question for you, and it deals with one of the first, if not the first, science fiction novel. And what do these things have in common? A dead frog, a volcano, and a teenage bride. Think about that for a second. A frog, a volcano, and a bride. Well, some of you already got it, and it's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The setting is in the 1780s. Galvani, Volta, and others were wandering the countryside, showing that with a dissected frog, if they put an electric shock on the frog's leg muscle, it would twitch. And so they thought that there was a correlation between electricity and life. It was in the air. In 1815, a volcano, Mount Tambora in Indonesia, exploded, and the following year, with all of the ash blotting out the sun, was what was called a year without a summer. Now, if you throw in that 1816, 5 individuals at the edge of Lake Geneva during it really was a dark and stormy night. Percy Shelley brought his 18-year-old wife, Mary, to visit his friend, the eccentric and infamous Lord Byron, at his home in Switzerland. Also present, by the way, was John Polidori, who would subsequently write The Vampire, which is the idea that Bram Stoker finally got. The weather was horrible. They stayed in, and they decided there would be a contest. Who could write the most horror story of them all? Well, Mary Shelley won, as you well know. Now, I'm not going to talk much about Frankenstein other than to say Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin had a horrible life. Her mom died shortly after giving birth to Mary. Mary grew up in a rough neighborhood, if you will. 3 of her 4 children died in infancy. Her sister committed suicide. Her husband died, drowned a few years later after having multiple affairs, possibly with Mary's sister. And she had to publish under a gender-neutral name. So she wasn't the monster. As you know, the monster in Frankenstein had no name. Frankenstein was the man that created the monster. But Mary had a tough life. It's important to note this. If you read the original Frankenstein from 1818 or the 1831 version, and then watch Boris Karloff's movie, you'll notice that any similarity, pun intended, between living and dead is purely coincidental. The movie is not at all like the book and vice versa. And that goes with Asimov's I, Robot and so on. So if you read the book and then you see the movie, you'll realize that the directors have to have some poetic license. Science fiction sometimes gets it wrong. People that are floating in space, it's not zero gravity, it's free fall. There's no formal directions in space. Flying in space is not like flying on the Earth. There's no atmosphere, so you don't need wings. Stuff blows up in space. Well, it doesn't make a sound and it doesn't blow up because there's no oxygen. People die in space, not by freezing or blowing up. There's a sound in space. Well, as you know, with the movie Aliens, no one can hear you scream in space. Creating a gravity environment in space is not easy. The sun is obviously on fire. It's a nuclear-bound fusion reactor. And the light year is a measurement of time. No, it's a measurement of distance. So there are some misconceptions. It takes months or years to get up or near the speed of light, and those G's, the human can maybe take up to 9 or 10 G's, but if you do a quick turn of a UFO going very, very fast, that's 700 G's, and no human, even with an atmospheric spacesuit, could take that. Stars are not close together. It's called space. Black holes. Well, the great movie Interstellar had to use some poetic license or the black hole would have completely filled up the screen. Reaching the core of Earth is going to be a lot harder than that movie. There will be problems with terraforming beyond what The Martian, that movie, showed. Asteroid belts are not densely packed. And Independence Day is one of my favorites. The huge spaceship wouldn't need death rays because of gravity. It would crush everything underneath it with tidal forces. So the science fiction writers don't always get things right, but often it requires poetic license for the plot of the story. Predictions can be right. H.G. Wells, and here you see some of them. He wrote about the Second World War before it happened. He described the fourth dimension. He predicted the suburb, the spaceship, the tank, alien invasion, and you can read all the things that he suggested would happen. Kepler, the movie 2001, and even the industrial laser and Goldfinger, James Bond's Goldfinger in 1964, was the first visible light ruby laser, was only invented 4 years earlier, and the infrared laser was patented the year of the movie. Asimov, who wrote 500 books, was a professor of biochemistry in New York and Boston, came up with the idea, as we'll see later, computers, supercomputers, and robotics. So real becomes real. Science fiction becomes science. The first widely available cell phone sure looked like the cell phone, the flip phone in Star Trek, didn't it? The submarine, atomic power, tasers, helicopters, rockets, FaceTime, and many other technological advances found their origins in sci-fi. And even Arthur C. Clarke suggested the idea of a GPS. So some of these things, if you can think about it, may occur. One of the things that I wanted to know is what is it that physicists would most like to know? And here are comments from 3 Nobel laureates. Einstein's greatest question, he said, was whether God had any choice in creating the universe. Kip Thorne, who just won the Nobel Prize for the demonstration of gravitational waves with LIGO, wanted to know these 5 things. How did the universe originate? Are there other universes? The nature of the singularity in the core of the black hole? Whether universes can be created by singularities, and whether backward time travel is possible. Preskill puts it in a literary way, is physics and environmental science. Do the laws of physics come from first principles, foundations that you just have to accept are there? Or is it by chance, a frozen accident? So a lot of science fiction authors know what the cosmologists are interested in and blend those into their stories. We all grew up with science and science fiction, and I suspect there's a lot of people out there that have heard of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Buster Crabbe played both, interestingly enough, and Tom Swift, which was one of my favorites, and incidentally was by the same group that did the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, which I thought was quite interesting. What is really interesting is we know about H.G. Wells, we know about Jules Verne, we know about Arthur C. Clarke, but there's a lot of writers out there, a lot of literary people who are not thought of being science fiction writers. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Oscar Wilde, Jonathan Swift, Arthur Conan Doyle, Mark Twain, C.S. Lewis, Margaret Atwood. And you see a variety of people. I've probably left out your favorite, and I apologize to them and you. But the moral of the story, as we'll see at the very end with Edgar Allan Poe, is that these literary figures, these authors, were really pretty smart cookies that kept up with science, even if they didn't write what was considered pure science fiction. Science fiction before 1950 was thought to be a second-class literature. But finally, January 1950, the New York Times ran a feature on science fiction saying that the field had finally graduated from the pulp magazines, Astounding Astronomy, Galaxy, the various pulp magazines that we are familiar with when we were younger, to its modern respectability of hardcover books. So finally, in the 1950s, science fiction became something that had a little more luster to it. Star Trek's continuing missions, as you know, is to explore strange new worlds, to seek out life and new civilizations. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek's last words 1 year before his death, the human race is a remarkable creature and one with great potential. And I hope that Star Trek has helped to show us what we can be if we really believe in ourselves and our abilities. So one of the reasons that Star Trek is so positive, so popular, is because it is so positive. Incidentally, as you probably know, Gene Roddenberry's ashes are now in outer space. So what are the new findings, the relatively new findings in physics, the true sciences, that science fiction authors could and have incorporated? Here you see some of them going down to relativity, quantum mechanics, subatomic particles, and various constants. If you look at astronomy and cosmology, origins of the universe. What is dark energy? What is dark matter? Can we use black holes for a variety of purposes, as we see in Interstellar, that recent movie? Cosmic inflation, stars, exoplanets, and so on. So what's interesting is I suspect there are thousands of science fiction authors right now at this time reading science avidly. Space travel, we've gone from drives and sails and guns and nanobots to exploration and colonization, to interstellar travel, alien contact. Maybe we can go faster than the speed of light. We can talk about that later. There will be generation ships. How are people going to live that long, or at least stay that long in ships, and other issues in space that we can talk about later. Now, what are the best science fiction movies? This is not my list, but this is a list I got off of Google. And you can see that according to some, Metropolis, Frankenstein, 2001, Alien, Star Wars, Blade Runner, The Fly, Jurassic Park, and so on. Those are some of the best science fiction movies. What about the best science fiction TV shows? Battlestar Galactica now has a whole series on TV. Doctor Who has been on TV for 50 years, 50 years, and has gone through over a dozen of the Travel Seeker. The X-Files, which I've got to confess, really gets you hooked on the idea of ET if you watch it, although I don't believe we've been visited. That's the story for another day. Star Trek, Westworld, Black Mirror, and so on, and you see some more at the bottom. We could have added more and more. And again, forgive me for leaving out your favorite ones. Science fiction, as I said, is kind of a mirror that is held up to us, that we can see ourselves. And so what it does with societal problems is it recasts them in a science fiction setting so that sensitive issues can be discussed without arousing too much controversy. It allows us a deeper explanation and examination of the ideas presented. It may present a more novel situation. It may be even causing us to rethink our position, although that's obviously very hard. A lot of these science fiction works are stand-ins for fears of nuclear war or nuclear atomic fallout. Think of the giant ants in Them, or communism and views on the Cold War, the day the earth stood still, and so on. Well, up until around 1938 and the publication of this book, which you've probably never heard of, and I had never heard of, but is a book that really influenced a lot of subsequent famous science fiction authors. Up until this time, in the late 30s, most aliens had 2 legs, 2 arms, a big head, 2 eyes that pointed forward rather than sideways. That's important because that's a sign of predatory activity rather than being eaten by another predator. And so Olaf Stapledon wrote this book and included all kinds of different creatures and live entities that were involved that we had never thought of. Since that time, computer-generated aliens and our imaginations have brought all kinds of aliens to our mindset. Huxley's Brave New World, the title based on The Tempest by Shakespeare, talks about social issues and genetic engineering before its time. And Forbidden Planet, 1957, was a favorite of lots of young boys for reasons that you see with Robbie and his friend. What's interesting in the Forbidden Planet, it was the first movie that had a totally synthesized musical track. Everything that was music was synthesized by computers. It obviously had Walter Pidgeon and Francis Leslie Nielsen. And so all of a sudden, science fiction had really upgraded with some very, very famous, well-known actors. It's brought up questions as, are we in a simulation? Like the movie Matrix. Do you want to take the red pill and see what's really out there? Or do you want to take the blue pill and remain as it is? Free will is questioned in the 2 Matrix sequels, which are not bad, by the way. And fate is discussed, analyzed in the movie The Adjustment Bureau. So there are a lot of major philosophical questions based on science fiction. There are books written on the philosophy of Star Trek, the philosophy of Star Wars, the philosophy of philosophy. But here are some of the items that are discussed in this book, The Philosophy of Star Trek. And you can see that from communication to logic to truth ethics, being human, the fragility of life, what is a meaningful life, what is the most perfect world, is the future open, and so on. A lot of philosophical ideas are brought out in Star Trek. In fact, this is a fun way of learning a little bit about philosophy and even people like Wittgenstein and Nietzsche. I want to end with Edgar Allan Poe. If you see his first editions, he went by Edgar A. Poe. Allan was the family that adopted him in Richmond, Virginia, but that's a story for another day. Edgar Allan Poe read a lot about science, and he talked about in his various poems and short stories about the origin of the universe coming from nothing. He knew about universal gravitation, a la Newton, and the reverse square law. He knew about the intuition in science, a la Polanyi. He knew about chaos theory, the telescope, Olber's paradox, where if the universe was static and eternal, then anywhere you looked should be bright as the sun or stars, which tells us that the universe is not infinite, at least in terms of what we see with our eyes. He came up with an idea of multiple universes as well as collapse of the universe. He felt that gravity would eventually cause deceleration of the universe because gravity will combine and finally cause everything to retract back into a clump. In fact, until 1998, everyone thought there was going to be deceleration of the universe until two groups in 1998 discovered the cosmological constant, lambda, or what we now call dark energy with acceleration. That's one of the keys of science, is you find something that you would have never thought of or believed. Star Trek is often a morality play, providing allegories, as I've said, for social issues like race. The first interracial kiss on TV was Star Trek. Gender, the nature of war, and religion. And as you see, it renegotiates the non-negotiable, forcing us to call into question some of our deeply held beliefs. Each episode deals with something that, like a Gendaken, a thought experiment, putting various theories to test by looking at their implications. So, as we come back on our 40-minute trip, I would quote Worf in Star Trek: "You have come seeking answers, but instead you have come to a place of questions. We still have lots of questions." We are a community of inquirers in Life Quest. Let's reflect the widest possible perspective. And as I would say, and I had to practice this, live long and prosper. Thank you. Any questions or comments or answers?
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, we would love to take your questions. Gina's going to be looking at those in.
It looks like Leah froze up to me, but David Dixon made a comment that it's a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Fred.
It's hard to ingest and digest
Bernadette?
all of it.
Yourself.
Thank you, David.
No, not a question. I was clapping.
I'm not sure if Bernadette had a question.
I would ask if anyone out there has a favorite science fiction book or movie or TV that I didn't mention, and they'd like to tell us why they liked it.
That was a clap, not a. I didn't raise my hand. I was clapping.
Clapping. Okay, well, David Dixon has a question. He has his hand raised.
Okay.
That was a clap.
Leah's having a hard time seeing the claps versus the questions.
Well, it is. I think I see Nan has a clap. Maybe that's a clap. Hard. They're all blue.
Leslie Singer has her microphone muted, so maybe she has a question. Nope, she muted it. You didn't mention one of my favorite books, but it crosses so many genres, and it's the current series that's on Stars right now. It's the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon, because in the beginning it's time traveling through the standing stones in Ireland, and it goes into the question of the ethics of going back in time and changing things. And then I like that one, but I like a lot of the ones you mentioned as well.
It's interesting, Gina. The Outlander series, I don't know if I wrote that down, but that was mentioned in that PBS, the Book of Books. And it was mentioned in a lot of the series that I saw. So you're with a lot of people, and maybe later on we'll talk about time travel and the ethics. Can you really go back and change history? And that's called the grandfather paradox. If you go back and kill your grandfather, how can you be around eventually to go back and kill your grandfather? So there's sort of a chronological protection conjecture. Novikov thinks this too, that somehow the universe is made to be safe for historians, is one way of putting it. That's kind of a joke, but kind of.
Diana has a question.
I wanted to
Okay.
find out, thank you, Dr. Fred, for the wonderful presentation. And I wanted to find out about Twilight Zone and Outer Limits. Those were two of my favorites.
Yeah, Twilight Zone was absolutely fabulous. And obviously the author back then of most of those was considered, as I recall, back in the 60s, one of the two, Rod Serling, was considered one of the two great screenwriters of the day, the other one being Paddy Chayefsky, who wrote The Hospital and other things. Yeah, Rod Serling was really an amazing person. So a lot of us, and a lot of future scientists really liked the Twilight Zone. It's interesting. The one I would say is, Kirk, that plays on Star Trek, was in one of those. And you probably remember the one where he's in an airplane and he sees this monster trying to tear up the wing as they're flying. And he's the only one that sees it. And they get down and they think that the guy that plays Kirk, Shatner, was really psychotic. And then they examine the wing and something had really torn off part of it. That would eventually, Robert Shatner would eventually become Kirk in Star Wars. William Shatner.
We have a question online from David and Karen Douglas. They ask, what about medical sci-fi such as Robin Cook's Outbreak?
Yeah, Robin Cook, as I recall, was a medical student at Columbia, although I didn't know him. We weren't there at the same time. And he eventually decided that he was like Michael Crichton, who was a medical student at Harvard. Crichton graduated, but both of them decided writing was more fun and maybe just as lucrative as being a physician. And of course, they both added immensely to the genre.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Leslie Singer here. You had mentioned something about free fall versus gravity. What we would call escaping Earth's gravity is really free fall. I understand that, but isn't there also a concept of gravity itself? And what's the difference between those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I can answer it. Gravity, as you know, a la Newton, was thought to be a strange force at a distance, which actually made people criticize Newton at all, although he had that famous formula. Einstein said, well, gravity is like acceleration, but gravity is really nothing more than bending space. Energy and matter tell space how to bend. space tells matter and energy how to move. But people still think that that's a subset of some overwhelming definition of gravity. Now, having said that, let me go to your question, because I think that is difficult to envision. It is said that people in our atmosphere, like in the ISS, it's not gravity that pulls them down or makes them look like they're in free fall. Is that they're really, what's happening is that they are falling, but their ship is going with the contour of the Earth. And so they're really not falling straight down. They're sort of falling with the contour of the Earth, and therefore they never hit the Earth. And that's really the free fall. But I think that that's a minutia, frankly. We generally call it gravity, but you know, it's like centrifugal force is not really a force with physicists. It's sort of a false force, if you will.
Fred, I have another question from someone in the chat. It says, what is your favorite invention stemming from science fiction?
Well, I guess the time machine, as I was growing up, especially the one that Rod played the major part with, I think Yvette Mimieux. Maybe it was, the answer was Yvette Mimieux. But in any event, I think the time machine was really amazing. I've got to say another thing, though, about H.G. Wells is that when he wrote War of the Worlds, he had graduated from, I think, Oxford. I don't think it was Cambridge. I think it was Oxford. In the book, one of the first places that got trashed by the tripods from Mars in the War of the Worlds was the university that he really didn't feel very kindly about. So he got him back.
I see some other unmuted microphones. Who has questions?
Fred, this is Roby.
Yes, Roby.
One of the things I made almost in passing on the chat was something you said earlier, which is that they often reflect the time, the movies especially, but the books as well, they reflect the time they were written as much as they were writing about the future. And one of my favorite examples of that is the Star Trek of the 1960s that was incredibly sexist, as was the 1960s. But you know, the women in short skirts. One of the famous ones was when a woman takes over Kirk's body and tries to lead the ship, which shows that women were too emotional to do so. I remember seeing that at the time, thinking that was a little strange, and seeing it 20 years later and thinking, God, what a sexist piece of crap. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in.
You know, those are issues like, you know, Huckleberry Finn in certain libraries. 1984, believe it or not, is the 5th most prohibited book written in the English language, 1984. And now we think, you know, maybe the only thing wrong was Orwell, which was a pseudonym, basically got the date wrong. But yeah, it's very, very obvious that even an Einstein with his brilliance is subject to and part of the time they live. And so, for example, if you were to clone Einstein for now, he might not be as smart now as he was back then. So we all are children of our time.
Jane Cornish, your thoughts on the butterfly effect, Jane and Pete.
Yeah, that's the chaos theory. What happened was there was a meteorologist, I think his name was Wigner, and he was running some elementary computer programs. And let me just give an example. This wasn't it, but one day he put in pi to try to predict the weather, which he put in as 3.141592653, 89793. That's as far as I know it. and ran it out. And the next day he was in a hurry, so he just put in 3.14. And as the program progressed, the divergence, if I can use that word, became more and more and more. And so what he decided, and he was sort of the father of chaos, is you really have to have an absolutely precise knowledge of the beginning, or it will spread as you go down the road in terms of time or length or whatever. And so that's what Wigner really kind of discovered as a meteorologist, is that we will never know anything absolutely precisely at the beginning, so that at the end of whatever we're measuring is going to be completely different. And the butterfly effect is the common analogy that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, then there will be a hurricane in Mexico or something like that. So a very, very, very small incremental change can eventuate into something absolutely major. I don't know if I said that very good. Robbie, you're good at these things. Do you have anything to add on that?
Not really, Fred. I would say that one of the things that I've always found fascinating is confronting something truly, quote, alien in science fiction stories. Childhood's End, I think, is someone mentioned that as one of the books where you really have to try to figure out that the alien and us can't link for whatever reason, and that if we link too much, we'll destroy each other automatically. So that they sort of seal the separation between them. I think it was some sort of universe click or something. My favorite science fiction story of all times, and I can't remember the title, unfortunately, but it was a story, and I think it was Heinlein's, that showed a spaceship coming through our solar system. We go out, we connect to it, we get inside, we recognize that there are beings inside, but they're all in sleep mode. And what we realize after a while is they're just passing through, using the sun as a vehicle to whip the gravitation to go on. And instead of thinking that the aliens were coming to see us, that the aliens weren't even interested in us. So I always just thought that was kind of a cute story.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, why would they be interested in us? But we're going to talk about that another time. I agree with you. Childhood's End, which is a short book by Arthur C. Clarke, is absolutely phenomenal. And I don't know about you, I won't ask you this, but I got to tell you, I had a few tears at the end of that. It was really, really extraordinary. The other short story I like by Arthur C. Clarke is these two, I think they were Japanese computer experts, were asked to create this huge, gigantic, immense computer that was the most powerful in the world. But there was a rumor that after, and it was built so that it would eventually say every name on the planet for God. Mm-hmm. And they don't believe it was going to happen, but just as and if that computer had done that, all the stars would blink out. Well, as they get on the airplane, they look up and the stars are falling from the sky. The computer had done it. So Arthur C. Clarke, if you look at cosmologists, professional astronomers, and this is not a careful survey, this is anecdotal, but my impression is that their three favorite science fiction authors are Arthur C. Clarke, because he got so much right, is Fred Hoyle, Sir Fred Hoyle, who's one of them, who is the father of the steady state theory, but he wrote a book called The Black Hole, which is just fabulous. I'll show a cover of that in a subsequent talk. And the third was Doug Adams, who, as you know, wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And he initially was part of Monty Python, and then he became part of Doctor Who, and then eventually came to the United States to do that movie. But they loved him because he was so irreverent. And if you want to read one page that will make you laugh, The Hitchhiker's Guide, the first page, I was laughing and laughing, and Jeannie thought I was on something. I wasn't, by the way.
One of my favorites for several years was the series of science fiction things that were built around orbiting satellites. And after a while, you just realize all they were doing is Westerns, but they were doing it in space. So,
You know, it's interesting you say that, because when Gene Roddenberry went to the people at the TV station, the big conglomerate, to sell his idea, that's exactly what he said. He said, what I'm trying to sell is a cowboy in outer space. I've got to tell one more story too, and that has to do with the father of Star Wars. He read 50 books on the different religions of the world. And his favorite book was by Joseph Campbell, who many of you have heard of. His favorite book was The Hero with a Thousand Faces. But that's why Star Wars, I think, is so meaningful to people, is that George Lucas had sort of incorporated all of these archetypes, all of these common hero myths that our progenitors and we live with in terms of how to live, how to be a good person, our place in the universe, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Homer with Ulysses and Odysseus started all of that too, with the hero's trip and being changed and coming back a changed person.
Fred, can you hear me?
Jump in.
Can you hear me, Fred?
Yes.
Hey, it's Randy. I have a scientific question. A lot of jet propulsion laboratories from all over the world, both public and private, are working on new methods of propulsion through space. And what is the latest on that in that arena, in that space, if I might say?
Yeah, Randy, thank you. I know you're busy, and I appreciate you logging in. I'm going to talk about space travel toward the end, but right now it's chemical, as you know. It's LOX, liquid oxygen, kerosene, liquid oxygen, and other propellants. The best would be matter, antimatter. The problem is, despite Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, which is a great book, we're not going to be able to create that much matter, antimatter, to make a light bulb go, even though that's the most efficient and effective. So all kinds of people, including Freeman Dyson, the futurist from the Institute for Advanced Studies near Princeton, unfortunately just died, but he thought we could use sails, huge, gigantic, thin sails that be propelled by lasers on the moon or from Earth or so on, or maybe even the sun. A lot of people are betting on things called ramjets, where they can scoop up hydrogen. The good news is that 75 to 90% of our universe is hydrogen. The bad news is only one molecule per cubic centimeter. So we've got a problem there, but people are exploring all kinds of propulsion methods, because that is the bugaboo. And you've got to have a tremendous exhaust, and what can create that is another problem. I think one of the most interesting is from a Mexican astronomer, cosmologist called Abakiri. And what he thinks is that a rocket can go through space not by moving through space, but by contracting space in front of you and expanding it in back of you. Now, I know that doesn't sound intuitive, but some people at NASA have felt that there may be something to that. The problem is, if you want to bend space, it requires a huge amount of energy that we just don't have. So the answer is lots of people are imagining lots of things. the bottom line is it's going to be a long time before we go to the stars, because the nearest star is Alpha Centauri, which is 26 trillion. That's a lot of zeros, trillion miles away. So you're going to have to bring some magazines.
Hey, Fred,
Yeah.
this is David and Karen.
David and Karen, how are you?
All right,
Oh,
you look
doing
great,
okay.
by the way. Got a question.
Oh, thank you. It's all makeup.
Jeannie did a good job.
Quickly, do you think the universe is teeming with life, everything from a single cell to the most complex? And what is the probability along that scale of life existing?
I'm going to talk about that hopefully in a next one of these.
Way to dodge a question.
The question is a great one. Are we the only life form, the only intelligent life form, if we can call ourselves that, in the universe, or is life teeming in the universe? There are books on that, and the answer is either 0 probability or a probability of 1. And what that means is that there are people like Brownlee and Ward, who wrote a book called The Rare Earth, who thinks that life on this planet went through so many coincidences that we were just lucky as heck to be here. On the other hand, we know that carbon-based molecules of some complexity are throughout the universe.
Mhm.
We know that, as you know, with spectroscopic studies and with meteors and things like that. And life occurred pretty fast on this planet. The problem is we only have an N of 1, and that's the Earth. So that's why it's so important to go to Mars or other planets or moons. Need to look at the moons like Europa and Titan and others, because if there is a second life that uses something other than the molecular alphabet, the molecular grammar that we use, the ATGCs, DNA, RNA, then that's pretty good evidence that if there's 2 different life forms in this small solar system, that with trillions, we're now up to trillions of galaxies, each of which we're now up to trillions of stars, each of which have at least 1 planet. 20% of those planets within the habitable zone, water is liquid, that far from the sun, life as we know it, that's a problem, life as we know it, then you play the odds and it's got to be there. I've got a quote in a subsequent talk from Ellie Arroway from Carl Sagan's Contact. And it says, what a waste of space if we're the only ones around. If we're the only ones around, and there's no way to prove that, but if we're the only ones around and the universe has become intelligent and can see itself through us, then we have even more of a responsibility to continue. Because if life is stopped here, then the universe is back at square 0.
Well, I saw
Fred, what a great way to stop. Sorry to cut in. I think we're going to have to wrap it up, but that was a great way to close. We didn't get to everybody's written questions. I think, Fred, this was a good pilot experiment.
Yeah.
You had 46 people join you today. I would call that a huge success in this time of online classes. We're so delighted to see Faye Jean here with us. And we saw Jerry Hansen earlier, and we're thrilled to have friends near and far from out of state and right here in Arkansas. Thank you very much, Fred, for doing this for us today.
Can I interrupt one thing?
Sure.
This topic was actually suggested by Faye Jean because she gave me a book by one of the professors near her in Virginia, and I read it and I thought this would be an interesting topic to talk about. So Faye Jean, thank you.
I've unmuted you, Faye Jean.
You're welcome.
She said you're great.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and wonderful to have you. So glad everybody was able to join us. Hope to see you again. Check us on the website. Oh, yes.